Hello friends, what's up? It's Jamie here. Welcome back to my channel. I don't know how often I've mentioned this, but I have become quite the Bridgerton fan in recent years. Originally, it was very much like just a guilty pleasure show for me in season 1, but from season 2 onward, I have become completely and utterly hooked. I am so excited for season 4 because I have been dying for Benedict's season ever since I first started watching. Ugh, I love Benedict. I love Luke Thompson. But that's not what this video is about, as much as I would love to talk at length about how much I love Benedict and Luke Thompson. But so if you watched Bridgerton season 3 and you were following along with the online conversations about the show like I was, then you probably know that one of the big things that people were talking about this season was how Francesca Bridgerton and John Sterling are very autistic coded, or at the very least neurodivergent coded in some capacity. Personally, I read Francesca and John as being autistic coded. I also perceive Eloise as being autistic coded. But something interesting that I noticed in the conversation surrounding this past season, and I could be completely wrong about this, I haven't read every single post or watched every single character analysis for these characters, so this really could just be something that I missed. However, I noticed that all these people who were pointing out that Francesca and John seem to be autistic coded, I really did not see anyone doing the same for Eloise. What I mean is, like, I've seen a lot of people cite Francesca and John as being the first neurodivergent coded characters in Bridgerton, when I'm like, Eloise has been there the whole time. And then I've also seen a lot of people express that they don't like Eloise, and their reasoning, the example that they use to explain their reasoning for not liking her, again, from what I've generally seen, are usually examples of her autistic traits. Regardless of whether you perceive Francesca and John and Eloise to be autistic coded, I think that there's a bigger conversation to be had here about how the likability of autistic people often affects them being labeled as autistic by allistic people. And I wanted to use the example of Francesca, John, and Eloise to talk about this, because as an autistic person myself, this is a topic that is very close to my heart, and it's Autism Acceptance Month, so I felt like this was as good a time as any to talk about this. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So in case you're watching this video but you're not really familiar with Bridgerton, or you're only vaguely familiar with the show, Bridgerton is an alternate history Regency romance television series based on the book series by Julia Quinn. This series follows the titular Bridgerton family, and each season follows one of the 8 Bridgerton siblings as they find true love. Now, despite being an alternate history show, Bridgerton is set in a version of Regency London, and so the term and diagnosis of autism would not historically exist in the show. But obviously, that has not prevented people, myself included, from labeling these characters as autistic coded, because even before the term autism and the diagnosis of autism existed, people were still autistic throughout history. Now, just as a disclaimer, by labeling these characters as autistic coded, myself and other autistics are not forcing you to view them as such. We are simply analyzing these characters through an autistic lens, which is informed by our experiences as autistics and the character information that is presented to us in the show, regardless of whether these characters were intended to canonically be perceived as autistic or neurodivergent. Now we're going to start with Francesca. I'd like to note that I used Sydney at Disabled Autistic Lesbians' autistic media review of season 3 of Bridgerton to help me create this list of the autistic traits that Francesca displays, since it has been a minute since I watched season 3. So Francesca is shown to be disinterested in the conversations with most of her peers because she's not interested in the things that everyone else is interested in. Because all the other young ladies of the town really talk about is men and marriage, which aren't things that Francesca is particularly interested in. Now, I had read this as very autistic behavior, but as we learn at the end of the season that Francesca's true love interest is Michaela, Francesca's lack of interest in men or marriage is also evidently due to the fact that she's queer, which also makes a lot of sense because, as Sydney points out in their video, there's a lot of overlap between autistic coding and queer coding, and we see this overlap in how Francesca is uninterested in men unless she can connect with them over her special interest. Francesca is quick to retreat to the piano when she is feeling overwhelmed by a social situation, and she often infodumps about music. And it's because John expresses a similar interest in music that they're able to form a connection. That and their mutual dislike for too much noise or crowds or prolonged social interaction, which I have also noted as the autistic traits that John has displayed. He also doesn't really speak in flowery language. He much rather prefers to be direct with his words and express his feelings through his actions. Now, I have seen many people readily and easily describe Francesca and John as being autistic coded, that they are wholesome because of their autistic traits. Now, I'm going to talk about Eloise, but put a pin in this thought. We are going to come back to it. Again, I would just like to preface that I used Sydney's autistic media review of Bridgerton Season 1 to help me create this list of Eloise's autistic traits. I would also like to note that Sydney is the only creator or online person that I have seen refer to Eloise as autistic coded, but we will come back to this thought. So Eloise needs other people to teach her how social skills work. She has no filter whatsoever, which often gets her in trouble. She is easily exhausted by prolonged social situations. She has sensory issues with some of her clothing. Her anxiety is generally very high all the time because of her being in extended social situations and the uncomfortable clothing that she has to endure at times. Her anxiety tends to manifest in how she fidgets with her clothing, how she forgets how to breathe, and how she often clings onto Penelope. And Eloise generally refuses to conform because she thinks that social norms are stupid. All of these traits are what made me and Sydney recognize Eloise as being autistic coded. I'd also like to quickly flag that Sydney points out how Daphne can also be seen as autistic coded, and after watching their review, I must say that I do agree. But I originally came up with the concept of this video after watching season 3 of Bridgerton, so that's why Daphne wasn't at the forefront of my mind, but I just wanted to include this for anyone wondering why I didn't factor Daphne into the conversation. Like I mentioned before, I found it really interesting to see so many people label Francesca and John as being autistic coded, but not doing the same for Eloise. And then when I thought about how well Francesca and John have been received within the fandom, obviously besides with the bigots who can suck my dick, versus how Eloise has been received and how much her character has been criticized, it made me wonder whether the lack of people recognizing Eloise as autistic has to do with the fact that they just aren't aware that she's exhibiting autistic traits, or because they don't want to label a character that they don't like as autistic in an effort to not be offensive to autistic people. Personally, I think it's a combination of both. It's pretty common for autistic people to only have knowledge of certain autistic traits and be ignorant of others. That's not really a new thing. But the fact that so many people are able to register Francesca and John as being autistic coded but not Eloise, to me also indicates another common phenomenon that I've seen occur with autistic people in real life. Something that autistic people aren't always able to recognize is that there is more than one way to infantilize autistic people. Of course, treating autistic people like inherently helpless babies who aren't able to advocate for ourselves is obviously infantilizing, but sometimes in an effort to be allies to autistic people, allistics will try to overcompensate by viewing autistic people as purely wholesome and adorable and precious little cinnamon rolls who can do no wrong, and or they refuse to criticize and dislike autistic people on the basis that they are autistic. Obviously, that's not to say that there's like a shortage of people who very openly and loudly bully and discriminate against autistic people. I'm specifically talking about allistics who are trying to be allies to the autistic community, but what they don't realize is that these sentiments are still infantilization, just packaged differently. Autistic people are not always wholesome. Not all autistic traits are going to be perceived as wholesome. In fact, most are not perceived that way. More often than not, autistic people get annoyed with very common autistic traits, and they're quick to write off these autistic people as bad friends or family members or just bad people because of those traits. So the allistics who try to be like, oh, autistic people are so cute, are usually full of shit anyway, because they are usually the first ones who will turn around so quickly and scorn autistic people for exhibiting traits that annoy them or make them uncomfortable. I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with thinking Francesca and John are wholesome, but I think it's important to interrogate and examine why you feel that way. Is it because you think they have a sweet friendship, a sweet partnership, or because you're like, oh, the cute little autistics? Because if it's the latter, Sounds like infantilization. And then on Eloise's end, recognizing her autistic traits and labeling her as such doesn't mean that all of a sudden you have to like her or that you can't criticize her actions. After all, autistic people aren't helpless little babies that you can't criticize. And the notion that you can't criticize autistic people or that autistic people are incapable of doing things that you dislike or disagree with is also infantilizing. You're not gonna like every single autistic person in the world. You're not gonna like every single autistic person that you meet in your life. But it's one thing to discriminate against autistic people for their autistic traits. It's another thing to just not like an autistic person because they're a bad person, or to not like an autistic person because you just don't like them. Take Elon Musk. I fucking hate that man with every fiber of my being. I don't hate him because he's autistic. I hate him because he's a fucking fascist. Like, that has nothing to do with him being autistic, and him being autistic clearly does not mean that he is above criticism. It should go without saying that when an autistic person is so clearly a piece of shit like Elon Musk, that it is okay to despise them and criticize them, but I am also of the opinion that in order for Aulistics to unpack and dismantle their infantilization of autistics, they need to be more comfortable with not liking every autistic person. Even if that autistic person isn't an outright terrible person, even if that autistic person hasn't done anything to them, I think personally that we would all be better off if Aulistics didn't feel obligated to like every autistic. Because no matter how much you might preach love and acceptance, at the end of the day, it is extremely unlikely that you are going to like every autistic person that you encounter throughout your life. For example, I have heard plenty of Aulistics say that they don't like Disney adults, that Disney adults are annoying and weird and too obsessive with their interests. And then when I have informed them that many Disney adults are autistic, they backpedal. All of a sudden, it's okay to be a Disney adult because they don't want to appear ableist. When it's like, you just said that Disney adults are annoying, but now all of a sudden, because you now know that a lot of them, while not always, a lot of them tend to be autistic, you're okay with them now? When you were just bashing their autistic traits like 2 seconds ago? Like, you see what I mean? It just feels extremely disingenuous because, like, you have not done any of the work to unpack why you can't stand Disney adults. It just feels like you're afraid of being labeled ableist, so now you're gonna act like you're cool with them when you weren't before. Listen, autistics can be annoying and cringe and weird. I say that as an autistic who has been annoying and cringe and weird many times throughout my life, and I am certain that I will continue to be all of those things for the rest of my life. I want to be very clear that Aulistics should and need to continue to unpack their internalized ableism and autistic which is the main reason why there is such a strong disdain for so many autistic traits in the first place. I'm not saying by any means that they shouldn't be interrogating or unpacking their bigotry, or that autistics shouldn't be interrogating their own internalized ableism, because sometimes a lot of the hate comes from inside the house. The point that I'm getting at is that not everyone is going to like me as an autistic person, but I wish that Aulistics understood that not liking someone doesn't mean that you shouldn't still treat them with respect and basic human decency, because some people and their traits are just not compatible with each other, no matter how much unpacking you do of your internalized ableism, and I feel like we all need to be more okay with that. Real acceptance shouldn't be Aulistics feeling like they need to be overly nice to us because we're like made of glass or some shit. But instead recognizing that there are always going to be people who are different from you, who do things that you don't always understand or think are weird, but as long as they are not hurting themselves or others, just let them be. It's none of your business. Circling back to Eloise, I don't want the takeaway to be Eloise exhibits autistic traits, so now I have to like her. You don't have to like Eloise's not like the other girl's personality. You can be critical of her friendship with and how she treats Penelope. You can and absolutely should criticize the pitfalls of her feminism because of her failure to own up to her privilege as a Bridgerton. Fantastic Frankie has a really good video about this on her Instagram that you should absolutely check out. I don't agree with all of her points because I do actually like Eloise and I do relate to her a bit, and I feel like her autistic traits add some needed context to why she acts the way she does, but it's still a great video and I still highly recommend it. But the point is that autism is inherently neutral. It is not inherently a good or bad thing. No one is inherently a bad person for being autistic, but no one is inherently a good person for being autistic either. And by recognizing this, my hope is that we can start moving to a place of actual autism acceptance in the media that we consume, but more importantly, in real life too. Alright, that's all I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I've been wanting to make this video since last year, and I really hope that I was able to get my points across in a way that made sense. And regardless of whether you agree with my analysis, I hope you guys at least found this video interesting or somewhat enjoyable. I had a lot of fun putting this video together, and so I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're interested in more in-depth autistic media analysis and autistic coding, I highly recommend that you check out Sydney's videos. I will have their YouTube and Instagram linked down below in the description. I also really recommend that you check out Frankie's videos. I always love her character analyses. Even if I don't always agree with all of her takes, I still love her videos. I will also have her Instagram linked down below as well. Once again, that's all I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I upload Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, except when I don't, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.